It's story time with your creepy Uncle Jizzo.
All right, you guys, it's Old Pal Jizzo here, and we're going to try something new. I'm going to read you a story from my new book, All the Devils, and we'll see what happens. This one is called Ginger or Marianne. Ginger or Marianne? You've heard this question before. If you were one of the stranded castaways on Gilligan's Island, which castaway would you bang? Ginger or Marianne? Most kids my age would have chosen Marianne. Marianne was less threatening. Marianne looked like she would understand you. Marianne could guide you through your prepubescent yearnings with better finesse. Yes, Marianne would have been my choice, always. Now, Ginger seemed more like a diva. I'd have to shower Ginger with shitloads of island gifts to woo her. And then after I'd spent all my coconuts, bananas, and kiwis on her, all I'd get for my troubles would be a measly hand job. A dirty little hand job for a dirty little boy. Well, f*** that. Ginger could go f*** herself. In fact, that's what she probably did. You see, when you're a 16 or 17-year-old kid growing up watching television all the time, this is what you did. Your mom was at work, you were stoned and bored, sitting on the couch watching TV, so to kill time, you would conjure up possible scenarios while you watched. You know, what would I do in these situations? For example, Gilligan's Island. First off, if I'd have been a castaway, Gilligan would have been dealt with much quicker. After he'd f***ed up our chances of getting rescued a few times, I would have gone full Lord of the Flies on his ass. I would have taken that conch shell and beaten him to death with it. F*** that guy. Marianne would then realize that I was the new alpha and gravitate towards me. The professor, sensing he was next in line for the conch, would hightail it to the other side of the island, where after a few months of solitary living, he would resemble the Unabomber, you know, long scraggly beard, torn clothes, etc., kind of like a modern-day Robinson Crusoe. The Howells, they would probably die of dysentery the first few weeks after being stranded, their easy life and wealth making them soft targets. Bye-bye, lovey. Now, the skipper and Ginger would then choose to stay with me, and we would sort of form an uneasy alliance. They probably wouldn't fuck, but they'd stay on my side of the island for protection, and eventually they would do my bidding. You see, I just completely restructured Gilligan's Island and turned it into Jizzo'S Island. Well, maybe you don't get it, but Marianne would understand. When you're a kid, all those 60s era television shows didn't make sense. For example, if I were Larry Hagman, I would have been banging I Dream of Jeannie from the get-go. From the time I found that bottle in the sand in episode 1, I would have quit my job as an astronaut, told Jeannie to conjure me up a mansion of gold, and spent the rest of my days doing bongs of killer weed and banging Jeannie. Of course I would do that. Any sane man would do that. But no, that was not allowed in the 60s. The same with The Ghost and Mrs. Muir. See, here we have a sexy MILF divorcee living in an isolated cottage with 2 dumb kids and a horny ghost sea captain. Sea captains were notorious for raping and pillaging, so it stands to reason that if I were the ghost, I would be going full-on incubus on Mrs. Muir nightly, and I mean nightly. The 2 kids, I would have gotten rid of them eventually, probably a boating accident. Now, that all made sense to me. All the solutions are simple when you are a sexually frustrated preteen with a vivid imagination and a full bag of weed. My memory hole has a special place for 2 shows, The Brady Bunch and The Partridge Family. My brother and I watched them both religiously. My brother even owned all the Partridge Family records. Now, if he was gone in the afternoon and I was alone, I would sometimes put on the first Partridge Family record and listen to it. It was actually quite good, and for me, a secret pleasure. But of course, I could never let on that I liked it. My world would shatter if my friends found out that I dug Keith Partridge. In their eyes, I could only listen to Black Sabbath and Aerosmith. Now, the Brady Bunch was a whole different matter. Marcia fucking Brady. She was it for me, for all of us. She was larger than life. She was not only hot, but iconically hot. She could be your friend, your girlfriend, your lover. She could help you with your sexual fumblings, and she would never put you down. That was important. And one time, my friend and I went to the Fallbrook Mall in Los Angeles, in the Valley, for a much publicized Marcia Brady live event. You believe it? We rode our bikes 5 miles in the California heat because we wanted to see Marcia Brady in person. The girl I watched on TV every week was going to be at the mall for reals, and that was something. We were going to see her. That is, stand in the light of her shining brightness as mere mortals, maybe touch the hem of her sainted garment, something like that. Picture meeting the Queen or the Virgin Mary. Such was my devotion. We waited and waited in the mall, hundreds of kids just like me, mostly young males, all of us feeling the first inklings of puberty, no real secondary sexual characteristics yet, but acutely aware of some vague stirrings, that weird unexplained heat. I think we waited for about 2 hours when all of a sudden there was a commotion. Someone said, "Marcia's here." And the mob of young boys made a sound that animals make when they see a pride of lions approach the herd. Their ears prick up and they get agitated en masse. That was us. I was standing near the stairway when I saw her from a distance, flanked by security and 2 burly bodyguards. As she approached, I sort of gasped. It was Marcia fucking Brady. It was her. She looked just like her character on TV. Long blonde hair, miniskirt, like a hologram. She also actually looked pissed off. Even from that distance, you could tell that she didn't want to be there. Now, there was a table set up in the middle of the mall court for autographs and pictures. And as she walked towards the table, we, as a herd, just followed her robotically, our legs moving in lockstep. We all muttered and mumbled and freaked out and poked each other. We lined up, holding our mall flyers and our little Instamatic cameras. Anyway, the line moved slowly, and finally it was my turn. At one point, I was literally across the table from Marcia Brady, of the Brady Bunch. I couldn't speak. I held out my flyer for her to sign, and I noticed she didn't even look at me. She just didn't look at any of us. She just sort of robotically signed, then moved on, signed, then moved on. As I stood there staring like a goat, tongue-tied and speechless, my overwhelming desire was to eat her. I wanted to eat her. I wanted to engulf her, absorb her. Was this teenage love? I guess so. It cannot be expressed because it can't be truly processed. You know, like Beatlemania, when teenage girls piss their pants screaming in their seats. That wasn't really quite rational either, but it was all their young bodies could think to do, piss. So I stood there frozen in time for what seemed like minutes, 10 minutes, when a security guard brusquely pushed me to one side, and suddenly the spell was broken. Afterwards, my friend and I rode our bikes home, disappointed. I waved that dumb flyer aloft like a flag as I rode. It turned out Marcia didn't want to ask me out. It turned out that she didn't want to be my girlfriend. The TV worship devotion thing was there, and then it was broken. Now, we lived near the old Spahn Ranch in the Chatsworth area, the old Manson family hangout. Can you imagine what that was like for a kid? The Manson hippy-dippy, murderous family hangout was only a bike ride away, up in the Santa Susana Hills near Chatsworth Park. Now, the ranch itself had burned down a few years ago, but you could still hike down there in the canyons and see shit. You could see shit. There were caves with real Manson family stuff scrawled on the inside. Helter-skelter shit. Real writing. Now, if you hiked in those canyons by yourself like I did, stoned, it was no stretch of the imagination to picture Lynette Squeaky Fromm jumping out from behind a tree, butcher knife in hand, screaming like a banshee. All those sex orgies, the drugs, the violence, all of it still hanging over the area like a thick dust cloud, like Shorty Shay's head on a pole screaming for his body to be found. Now, there came a time when my friends and I dared each other to spend the night in a sleeping bag at the old Spawn Ranch. I remember we pulled up one night to check it out. We turned off the engine of my friend's car and sat there on the side of Santa Susana Road. Pitch black. No street lights, no sound. Black as black. Only the looming presence of the hills and the evil contained therein. None of us said a word. We all felt it. We all felt it. After 5 minutes or so, we all sort of agreed in an unspoken voice, "F*** this," and drove away. Spawn Ranch was creepy enough during the day, but at night, well, you've seen the Saw movies, you know. My parents used to host parties at the old house I grew up in. They had a big screen TV back when those were rarities. They also had the rarity of pay-per-view events, HBO boxing, WWF wrestling. My parents used to hang out at a bar in Northridge called The Classroom, and every pay-per-view event they had brought the entire bar over for drinking and cavorting. Anyway, my parents and this bar crowd also had what they called a softball team that played every Sunday. And when I say team, I use that term loosely. This Sunday softball team was really just an excuse to take the binge drinking outside. Coolers of beer, lots of strikeouts, beer guzzling, forced errors, missed catches, laughing and cheering. That's what it really was. Now comes the weird part. I don't know how or when this happened, but at some point, Hervé Villechaize came to one of these softball games. Now, if you've never heard of Hervé Villechaize, he was Tattoo on Fantasy Island. He was the little guy, or little person in the parlance of our times. Back then, I would have called him a midget or dwarf. Anyway, he was a really small guy. So being a proficient drinker himself, Hervé Villechaize started to attend these Sunday games, and at some point, my parents became drinking buddies with him. My parents started to hang out with Tattoo. It was kind of unbelievable. And so now the stage is set for what happened next. My parents were hosting another one of their beer drinking pay-per-view parties, and I was invited. There were always plenty of good food there, buckets of chips and dip, potato salad, burgers and hot dogs. It was a fucking feast for a stoner kid like me. So that's what we did. Me and a friend of mine drove up to the house and parked down the street. We filled our little glass pipe with special good weed, not the usual Mexican dirt weed. We got good and stoned on green buds and prepared to feast on good food and boxing. The front door was open, so we didn't knock, so we just opened the screen door and entered. And that's when I saw Hervé Villechaize sitting on my stepdad's lap. He was bouncing on my stepdad's knee like a fucking baby. I froze. I totally froze. And the first thing that came to my mind was, why didn't anyone tell me that my stepdad was such a good ventriloquist? I mean, he was amazing. The tattoo doll on his lap was waving his arms around and talking in that weird gibberish voice of his. He even had the voice down. I mean, how is he doing this? You gotta understand what I was thinking. I mean, Tattoo could not really be there. I mean, that was impossible. Therefore, this must be a lifelike Tattoo ventriloquist dummy, and my stepdad is some sort of genius fucking ventriloquist. That was how I processed those 10 or 20 stone seconds. My mom must have seen my face. because she started to laugh. She grabbed my arm and pulled me over. "This is Hervé," she said. "Come meet Hervé." "That's Tattoo," I sputtered. "Tattoo is in our house." "Yes, yes," she said. "Come meet him." My stepdad stopped bouncing. The dummy suddenly turned human, Tattoo, and he jumped off my stepdad's knee like an Oompa Loompa. He was an Oompa Loompa. He came up to my waist. He was only 3 feet high. "Good to meet you," he said in that weirdo voice. I stammered a little. I couldn't say anything. I was really stoned. So I just started to laugh. I really started to laugh. And then Tattoo laughed because he knew it was absurd. I wasn't laughing at him, but at the incongruity of the situation. Who's coming over next? Superman? Green Lantern? The microcosm of pre-adulthood is forever enshrined in my mind and is savored and enjoyed again by its telling. Being 16 seems like an ocean of time away, and I guess it is. It seems like another person that hiked the hills looking for Manson, another person hanging out at the mall. Your entire comfort zone was defined by a bag of weed and a large Dr. Pepper. That was it. That was all you needed to feel safe. Friends, bong loads, TV, junk food. Adulthood was still years away, and that was okay. No guilt, no shame, no worries, no pain. And then, inevitably, you have to grow up. It's a shame.